The stamp is a piece of brass the size of a deck of cards. It weighs almost nothing. I've carried it in the left breast pocket of my coveralls for 11 years, wedged between a folded work order from my first solo inspection and a laminated card that lists, in my mentor's handwriting, the torque values for the 6 most common manifold fittings in the Halcyon-class drive assembly. The stamp itself is unremarkable. The merchant service seal on one face, the word certified on the other, and below that my license number, DKT9 Mechanic VANTHORPE, pressed into the brass in letters about 4 millimeters tall. When you rock it into an ink pad and press it down onto paper, it leaves a clean print, blue-black and slightly imperfect at the upper left corner because the pad is old and I've never replaced it. I keep it because my mentor told me to keep it. I've almost left it behind maybe a dozen times, once on a repair dock at Callister Station, once in a locker at Threshold that I had to sprint back for. I always go back for it. I did not understand why until the day the Vreth came to berth 41 at Calvin Waystation and told me the Ilva Constance didn't exist. Let me explain what I mean. The Ilva Constance is a Halcyon-class civilian cargo hauler registered out of the Nava Merchant Compact, hull number 7, Tech Constance, and she has been limping through transit circuits for 22 years. She is not a beautiful ship. Her hull plating along the port forward quarter is a different shade of gray from the rest of her because it was replaced after a debris strike 3 years before I was born, and whoever sourced the replacement panels didn't bother to match the factory anodizing. Her crew quarters smell like recycled air and something faintly vegetable, which I've been told is from a hydroponics unit a previous captain installed without proper ventilation, and which has never been properly remedied. Her drive assembly, a Solentech manifold stack rated for the mid-range commercial transit load she was built to carry, is 22 years old and has approximately 140,000 operational hours on it. It needs looking at every time she comes through a waystation with a licensed mechanic on the roster. That has been me, at Calvin, for 7 years. I know the Constance the way you know a patient you've been treating for a long time. I know where she makes a sound she shouldn't. A faint metallic tick in the number 3 coupling housing that shows up only when the ambient temperature in the berth drops below 12 degrees. I know that her primary pressure gauge reads 2.3% low because of a sensor calibration drift that her captain refuses to pay for me to correct. So I just add 2.3% in my head when I check it. I know that her number 7 injector seal has been replaced so many times that the housing threads are worn, and I have to apply an additional half-turn of torque over spec to get a reliable seat. And I note this every single time in the service record, and every single time the next mechanic at whatever waystation she's passing through reads my note and follows my procedure and the seal holds. That's how it's supposed to work. That's the whole point of a service record, not just documentation of what happened, but the living thread of what was found and what was done and what the next person needs to know. My mentor called it the chain of accountability. She was not prone to grand language, so when she chose a phrase like that, she meant it precisely. A chain, link by link, each one depending on the strength of the one before it. Calvin Waystation sits at the junction of 3 transit corridors. The Nava Compact's primary inner route, the Threshold to Selen commercial loop, and a secondary branch that carries survey traffic out toward the edge surveys. It is not a grand waystation. It's medium-sized, medium-trafficked, the kind of installation that has been quietly essential for so long that nobody thinks much about it anymore. The berths are numbered sequentially, and berth 41 is mine, not formally mine, not on any organizational chart, but mine in the way that a workbench belongs to the person who keeps it for 7 years, who knows its dimensions by reach and its quirks by long familiarity. The overhead light in 41 has a slight flicker at startup that resolves after about 90 seconds, and I've stopped reporting it because it always resolves, and the maintenance crew has enough to do. The composite floor has a crack running from the secondary equipment bracket to the northeast drain that appeared 2 years ago and has not grown since. I track these things the same way I track everything, not because I expect them to matter, but because I don't expect them not to. The morning the Vreth arrived, I was 40 minutes into the Constance's scheduled maintenance window, a 6-hour block that Colvin's Port Authority had granted before she could continue on her run to the Nava Compact's secondary hub at Selen. 6 hours is tight for what she needed, but her captain, a broad-shouldered woman named Hella Morrish who has been flying the Constance since before I started working at Colvin, runs a tight operation, and she knew I'd been prepping for the visit. I had the parts staged, I had my tools laid out. I had the service record open on my tablet, and I'd already noted the work order number, the date, the berth number, and the atmospheric conditions in the berth at time of work commencement, which is a habit my mentor drilled into me so deeply that I still do it even though I have never once been in a situation where the atmospheric conditions at commencement made any legal difference to anything. It's not that I think it will matter. It's that I don't know it won't matter, and those are different things, and my mentor was very clear on that distinction. I was replacing the number 7 injector seal, new seal, same extra half-turn of torque noted in the record, when the Vreth entered the berth. There were 3 of them. Vreth inspection teams always come in 3s. It has something to do with their internal governance structure, the idea that no single individual or pair can be considered authoritative without a third to validate the observation. They are tall, taller than humans by a significant margin, and they carry their height in a way that seems designed to be noticed. Not a threat display exactly, but something adjacent to it, an insistence on vertical space that I've noticed in every Vreth inspection team I've dealt with, as consistent as a procedural requirement. Their carapace plating, the segmented outer layer that covers the upper body and shoulders, is a pale greenish-gray in the harsh overhead light of berth 41, and it shifts subtly as they move, the segments articulating in ways that suggest more joints than I can easily track. Their faces are narrow, triangular, with 4 eyes in a horizontal band across the upper third, and they have a habit of turning the head very slowly to survey a space rather than moving their eyes, which my mentor described as like watching a lighthouse rotate, and which I have always found accurately unsettling, not threatening, just calibrated in a way that reminds you the calibration was done elsewhere, for different purposes, by a different logic. The lead Vreth, I could tell it was the lead because it carried the primary data tablet, a smooth slab of translucent amber material about twice the size of mine, swept the berth with that slow lighthouse turn, noted me, noted the Constance's open manifold access panel, noted the equipment staged on the work cart, and then spoke. The translation system at Colvin, a standard compact tissue relay, the same kind used in most multilateral waystation environments, rendered its words into standard compact about a half-second after it finished speaking, which is always a slightly disorienting experience, like watching a film where the audio is subtly out of sync with the image. This vessel's maintenance window is registered under a compact-authorized service provider, it said, or rather the translation system said, in the flat, affectless register that compact translations always default to. We are conducting a compliance audit under Vrethian Transit Authority directives. Please present your credentials and pause all current work. I looked up from the injector housing. I had the old seal in my left hand and the new seal in my right. The new seal was coated in a thin layer of the compatible lubricant I used to ensure a clean seat, and my right glove was accordingly smeared with it. Dara Kess, I said. Merchant Service License DKT 9 Mechanic VANTHORPE. Compact Authorized Service Provider, Colvin Waystation. I set the old seal down on the clean tray I keep for removed components and held out my tablet with my left hand. Work order and service record are on the tablet. I'll pause when I've seated the new seal, it's been removed, and exposure to the berth atmosphere means the clock is running on contamination risk. Give me 4 minutes. The Vreth lead did not respond for a moment. It turned its head toward the second Vreth, and the two of them exchanged something. The Vreth have a secondary communication mode that involves subtle movements of the carapace segments, a gestural language that the translation systems don't capture. And then it turned back to me. 4 minutes, it said. We will observe. They stood where they were, all three of them very still, while I seated the seal. I've had people watch me work before. Inspectors, port authority officials, sometimes the captain herself, who has a hands-on approach to her ship's maintenance that I respect even when it means I have someone standing at my elbow asking questions while I'm trying to torque a fitting. None of it bothers me much. The work is the work, and it doesn't change because there's an audience. I applied the half-turn of torque over spec, double-checked the reading, noted it in the tablet record, and then I stepped back from the access panel, stripped my smeared glove, replaced it with a clean one, and turned to face the inspection team. Ready, I said. What followed was, on its surface, a routine compliance audit. The Vreth inspection process is thorough. I'll give them that. They had what appeared to be a complete registry of every vessel transiting through Calvin in the current window, every authorized service provider operating in the waystation, every outstanding work order and its associated compliance status. The lead Vreth scrolled through records on its amber tablet with a kind of patient mechanical efficiency that reminded me of nothing so much as a cataloging system running through a very large index, unhurried and comprehensive. The other two moved through the berth, scanning equipment tags, running their handheld sensors over the Constance's hull, noting readings in their own tablets without commentary. I handed mine over when asked. The lead Vreth reviewed my credentials, my work order, my service record for this visit, and then it moved through several more screens that I couldn't fully read from my angle, cross-referencing something in its own system. It was all in order. It is always in order. I keep meticulous records. My mentor made sure of that. License verified, the Vreth lead said after several minutes. Work order confirmed. Service record for current visit reviewed. It paused, and in that pause the second Vreth, the one that had been scanning the hull, said something in its own language, and the translation came a half-beat later. Discrepancy noted in the vessel's compliance registry. I waited. The Ilva Constance, the Vreth lead said, is registered under the Nava Merchant Compact as hull number 7, Tech Constance. Our registry records indicate this vessel's last certified maintenance window was completed at Threshold Station, cycle prior to this one. We are unable to confirm that work under that cycle's entries meets current Vrethian Transit Authority compliance standards, as it was performed under a compact-only authorization that predates the joint transit framework established in the Calvin Accord. I looked at it for a moment. The Calvin Accord, I said, established a mutual recognition framework for service providers already certified under either the Compact or the Authority. My license was issued under the Compact. It's recognized under the Accord. Your current work is not in question, the Vreth said. The prior cycle's work is in question. We cannot verify compliance conformance for work completed at Threshold Station under a compact-only authorization by a service provider whose credentials were not at that time cross-registered under the authority's secondary validation system. I understood what it was saying. There is a section of the Calvin Accord, a section that was inserted late in the negotiation process, and that every compact service provider I know has opinions about. That requires retroactive cross-registration of credentials for any work cited as part of a vessel's compliance history during an authority audit. The mechanic who serviced the Constance at Threshold in the prior cycle was a compact license provider who had not completed the cross-registration process at the time of that service. The work itself was valid. I knew her reputation, competent, careful. the kind of mechanic who notes her torque values. The seal she replaced is sitting in a recycling bin at Threshold Station right now, replaced on this visit by a new one, and the work she did was good work. But under the letter of the Accord's retroactive compliance provision, the authority had grounds to flag that prior service record entry, which meant they had grounds to question whether the vessel's maintenance compliance chain was unbroken, which meant they had grounds to initiate a hold. A hold on a cargo hauler in the middle of a transit window means she doesn't go anywhere. Doesn't matter if the work she carries is perishable. Doesn't matter if Hella Moorish and her 4-person crew have connection windows to make at Selen. The ship sits in the berth until the compliance review is resolved, and compliance reviews through the Vrethian Transit Authority move at the pace of a bureaucratic system that has, by my rough estimate, about 140 years of accumulated procedural architecture behind it, each layer of process laid carefully on top of the last, each layer designed to be internally consistent with all the layers below it. I looked at the Vreth lead. It was watching me with that horizontal band of 4 eyes, patient and entirely without malice. It was not doing anything wrong, exactly. It was doing precisely what it was built to do, which was apply a compliance framework with the precision of something that had been optimizing that framework for longer than humanity had been going to the stars. The framework existed to ensure that vessels in transit met maintenance standards. That is a good reason for a framework to exist. The problem wasn't the framework's purpose. The problem was that the framework's implementation had created a procedural gap between what the mechanic at Threshold had done and what the authority's system could verify. And in the absence of that verification, the system defaulted to the only position it had available to it: hold. I understand the concern, I said. Let me show you the Constance's full service record. Not just the current visit's record. The full record, the accumulated history I keep in my own files, separately from the official registry, because my mentor told me to keep it, and I've kept it the same way I've kept the brass stamp, out of habit and a faint, persistent sense that it would matter someday. I pulled it up on my tablet and handed it over. The Vreth lead took the tablet and began to read. Its 3 colleagues, I'd lost track of the third one, who had been scanning equipment tags, but was now positioned near the work cart, oriented toward the tablet as well, the slight carapace movements I'd come to recognize as interest or attention. They read for a long time. The Constance's service record goes back 14 years, to the year before I started working at Calvin, and my entries alone run to something like 40,000 words of accumulated notation across 217 service visits. Every seal replacement, every torque value, every atmospheric conditions at commencement notation, every note about the number 3 coupling tick and the 2.3% sensor drift, every extra half turn on the number 7 injector housing, every name of every mechanic who worked on her before me, noted in my records even when they weren't noted in the official registry. Because when you're maintaining a ship for years, you want to know the full chain of who has had their hands in her, and what they found, and what they did about it. This documentation, the Vreth lead said, is extensive. Yes, I said. It does not resolve the compliance question regarding the prior cycle's entries. The retroactive cross-registration requirement applies to the official registry record. This documentation does not replace the official record. No, I said, it doesn't, but it does show you what was done and when and by whom, and it shows you that the work was sound. I paused. Can I ask what specifically you'd need to resolve the hold? The Vreth lead explained at some length what would be required. There was a review process. There was a petition process for retroactive compliance certification. There was a standard timeline for such petitions, measured in what the authority called review cycles. And when I asked how long a review cycle was in standard days, the Vreth gave me a number that I received with my face entirely still, because I have spent a long time in my career learning how to receive unfavorable numbers with my face entirely still. It is a useful skill in a profession where unfavorable numbers are professionally common. Hella Moorish was going to be in this berth for considerably longer than 6 hours. I asked the Vreth lead a few more questions, very specifically worded, about the scope of the audit and what was and wasn't under review. It answered each one with the same patient precision. What I was doing was building a picture of the exact shape of the problem, where the edges were, what the actual mechanism of the hold was, what specifically the authority system was flagging, and in what part of the record. My mentor used to call this finding the gap in the fence. She said there is always a gap. The trick is not to climb through it before you've found all of it, because if you climb through before you know where the edges are, you can find yourself more stuck than you started. I thanked the Vreth lead for its time, told it I needed to review some documentation and would have a response shortly, and it indicated, with the slight carapace segment movement I'd learned to read as the Vreth equivalent of a nod, that it would wait. I walked to the far end of the berth, where Hella Moorish was standing at the foot of the Constance's boarding ramp with her arms folded, and an expression on her face that I have seen many times. She's directed it at dock managers, at port authority officials, at customs agents who have held her cargo for spurious reasons. She has never, in 7 years, directed it at me, because I've never given her a reason to. I was hoping today wasn't going to be the exception. "How bad?" she said. "Let me think for a minute," I said. She unfolded her arms. This is the other thing about Hella Moorish that I respect. She knows when to wait. She's been flying cargo haulers long enough to understand that the moment when someone you trust says they need to think is not the moment to start talking. I thought for a minute, actually longer than a minute, probably closer to 5, standing at the foot of the boarding ramp with my arms folded and my eyes on the floor of the berth, which is sealed gray composite with yellow caution striping, and the kind of reflective surface that bounces back the overhead lighting in a way that's useful for finding dropped fasteners. The Vreth inspection team waited where it was. The second and third team members had come to stand with the first, near the entry to the berth, the 3 of them arranged in a configuration that felt very orderly and very permanent. Here is what I had worked out by the time I finished. The authority's compliance system was built to audit a specific class of objects, digital records, credentialed in a specific way, submitted through a specific interface, flagged according to a specific schema. The schema had been developed carefully and thoroughly over many years of operational refinement. It was comprehensive within its domain. That's the thing about well-built systems. They are genuinely comprehensive within their domain. The gaps are not in the domain they were built to cover. The gaps are at the edges. The authority's compliance system was flagging the prior cycle's service record entry because the credential of the mechanic who performed that work could not be validated against the authority's cross-registration system. The flag applied to that entry in the official registry. What the authority's system was not flagging, could not flag, because it had no mechanism to flag it, was anything that did not exist in the official registry. The review and petition process the Vreth lead had described applied to the official record, to things that were in the system. My service record is not in the official registry system. It's in my files. It's on my tablet. It is, in the authority's framework, a supplementary document, one that the Vreth lead had reviewed and acknowledged and then correctly identified as not replacing the official record. That's true. It doesn't replace the official record. But the service I perform during a given visit does get entered into the official record by me, because I'm an authorized provider and the port authority system here at Calvin gives me right access to the official maintenance registry for vessels I'm servicing. Every digital entry I make goes into the system. The system timestamps it. The system validates my credential in real time. The system knows who I am. Every digital entry. I reached into the left breast pocket of my coveralls. I took out the brass stamp. I looked at it for a moment, the slight tarnish on the merchant service seal, the dent on one corner from when it fell out of my pocket during an inspection at Callister Station, and I had to spend 20 minutes crawling under a manifold housing to find it, the old ink still visible in the recesses of the lettering from the last time I'd used it. I don't use it often. Most documentation is digital now. Most ports don't even have paper forms anymore. Calvin does, because Calvin is an old waystation, built before the full digital transition, and there are still physical forms in the Port Authority filing system, actual paper forms, and there is still an ink pad in the drawer of the administrative desk in the mechanics station at the head of berth 41. And I know this because I am the mechanic at berth 41, and I have opened that drawer approximately 400 times in 7 years, and the ink pad has been there every single time, getting gradually drier and less saturated, and yet somehow never quite running out. I went to the mechanics station, I opened the drawer, I took out the ink pad, I set it on the desk. The pad is a standard issue merchant service type, the kind sold in administrative supply catalogs at every major port in the compact's footprint, in a flat tin with a hinged lid that leaves an ink mark on your thumb if you open it carelessly. Mine is old enough that the tin's finish has worn through at the corners to bare metal underneath, and the sponge layer inside has compressed over years of use to about half its original depth, which is why the prints it makes are slightly imperfect at the upper left corner, where the compression is worst. I've thought about replacing it many times. I've never done it, partly out of inertia and partly because the imperfection has become identification. I know my own stamps by that corner, the way you know your own handwriting by its particular irregularities. Then I took out the physical work order for this visit. Every maintenance visit at Calvin generates 2 records. One is the digital entry in the official registry, which I submit through the Port Authority terminal at the end of the visit. The other is a physical form, a printed work order, 3 copies, one for my files, one for the vessel's captain, one for the Port Authority administrative records. In practice, almost nobody uses the physical forms anymore. They sit in the filing system because the system requires them to be filed, but nobody looks at them. Nobody depends on them. Nobody thinks about them until the moment somebody does. I fill mine out because my mentor filled hers out and she told me to fill mine out, and I don't have a good reason not to, and it takes me about 3 minutes per visit, and 3 minutes per visit is not a price I've ever begrudged. The work order for this visit already had the job details filled in: work order number, date, berth number, atmospheric conditions at commencement, vessel name and hull number, service description, parts used and their source codes, time of work commencement. I filled in the completion fields: time of completion, my signature in the service provider line, and my license number in block letters below it, because the signature alone is not identifying enough. A signature can be argued about, but a clearly printed license number beneath it cannot. Then I held the stamp with my right thumb on top, the way my mentor showed me, so the pressure distributes evenly across the face, and I rocked it once into the ink pad, feeling the slight resistance of the compressed sponge, and then I pressed it down squarely into the certified field at the bottom of the form. I held it for a count of 3. My mentor said 1, I do 3. Old habit, extra margin, same result. I pulled the stamp away. The print was slightly imperfect at the upper left corner, the way it always is. I let the ink set for a count of 10. When it was dry, I filed 1 copy in my records. I took the other 2 and walked back out into the berth. I gave one to Hella Morrish, who looked at it with an expression I couldn't fully read, but which did not look like the folded arms expression from 5 minutes ago. Then I walked over to the Vreth inspection team. I'd like to present a supplementary compliance document, I said to the lead, and I held out the second copy. The Vreth lead took it. It looked at the form for a long time, longer than it had looked at anything during the audit, including my full supplementary service record. The second and third team members oriented toward it as well, reading from their angles, carapace segments moving in the rapid way I'd learned to associate with close attention or active calculation. When the lead looked up, it held the form out slightly, not handing it back, just presenting it, the way you hold something you're still processing. "This is a physical maintenance record," it said. Yes, Colving's Port Authority operates a dual record system, digital entries in the official registry, and physical forms filed under the Port Authority's administrative record. I had spent part of my thinking time making sure I had the charter language right, because the charter language was the foundation. If I was wrong on it, nothing else mattered. Both records have legal standing under the Colving Compact Charter. The charter predates the Colvin Accord by 12 years, and the Accord did not supersede charter-level documentation standards. I paused to let that land. The physical record documents the maintenance work performed on this vessel during the current visit, under my authorization as a compact licensed service provider, credentials verified and valid at time of work. The compliance concern you've raised pertains to work performed in a prior cycle by a different provider. The current work, what I've done today, is documented in both the digital and physical records and is fully compliant on its face. The compliance concern regarding the prior cycle's record remains open, the Vreth said. It does, I agreed. But the compliance concern regarding the prior cycle's record applies to that record, not to the current visit, and the question relevant to whether this vessel is permitted to continue its transit is whether the current maintenance has been completed to standard by a qualified provider under a valid authorization. I kept my voice level and specific, the way my mentor taught me, not aggressive, not appeasing, just clear. The argument was either sound or it wasn't. My adding emotion to it would not make it sounder. It has been. Both records show this. The Vreth lead looked at me. Then it looked at the physical form again. Then it said something in its own language, a longer string than anything it had addressed to me directly, and the three of them engaged in what I took to be a genuine working through. Carapace movements rapid and varied, pauses that felt like consideration rather than hesitation, and at one point, what appeared to be a substantive exchange between the second team member and the lead, with the third observing. I don't know what they were discussing specifically. I have a working hypothesis, based on how the conversation ended, that the second team member was raising the same logical conclusion the lead eventually articulated, and they were cross-checking it, because that's how the Vreth validation process works. No single observer, no single conclusion. Three parties arrive at the same place by independent paths, or they don't arrive. They arrived. My mentor's rule about staying quiet after the argument is made is one of the hardest things she taught me, and one of the most consistently useful. The instinct when you're waiting on a decision that matters is to keep adding context, keep explaining, keep filling the silence with the sound of your own competence so nobody forgets you're there. She said this instinct is almost always wrong. Silence after a well-made argument is not emptiness. It's the argument doing its work, the other party following the logic to wherever the logic leads. If the logic is sound, it leads somewhere. Your job is to not interrupt it. I stood quietly and let the argument do its work. The Vreth lead said, after what felt like a long time, the authority's compliance framework does not include a category for physical paper documentation authenticated by an ink impression stamp. I looked at it. That's correct, I said. A pause. The carapace movements had settled to the slow, deliberate pace I associated with a conclusion being formulated. We are unable to process an uncategorized document type within the current audit framework, it said. The physical record you have presented cannot be entered into the authority's compliance review as a flagged item, as we have no classification under which to flag it. I waited. Correspondingly, it said, and here there was something in the translation, some quality in the carefully rendered flat register, that I can only describe as the sound of a logic chain arriving somewhere its builders had not intended. We are unable to classify the current maintenance work documented in this record as non-compliant, as the documentation format is not within the scope of our audit tool's assessment parameters. I said nothing. The digital record for the current visit is compliant, the Vreth lead continued. The prior cycle's digital record remains under review under the standard petition process. The scope of the current audit is the current visit's compliance status. Yes, I said, that's correct. A pause, longer than the others. The ILVA constants, the Vreth lead said, is compliant for the purposes of this visit's audit. I nodded once, thank you. The prior cycle's record remains open for review. Documentation will be provided to the vessel's registered captain. Noted. Captain Morrish will want the details so she can address it with the prior service provider's licensing authority at threshold. We will provide documentation. The Vreth lead made a notation on its amber tablet. The other two did the same. Then all three of them moved toward the berth exit with the quiet, unhurried efficiency of a system that has completed its function and is moving to the next task. No hostility, no acknowledgement of the unusual, just a completed audit and a result filed. I watched them go. Then I looked down at the brass stamp in my hand. There was a small blue-black ink smear on my right thumb, the same thumb I always use to hold the stamp steady when I press it. It's been there, in various degrees of freshness, for 11 years. At some point it stopped being something I washed off between uses and became something I just carried. A faint occupational mark the way mechanics carry calluses and machinists carry a particular smell that doesn't fully rinse out. Helen Morrish was at my elbow. She had walked over very quietly, which is something she's good at for a woman her size. You want to explain what just happened, she said. In a minute, I said. Are we going to make your connection at Selene? She checked her wrist terminal. If we push the departure window, we might lose 20 minutes of margin, but yes. Then let's get back to work. I still have 4 hours left in your window, and there's a pressure gauge calibration I want to discuss, and there's something on the injection rails I need to look at before I tell you about it. She looked at the stamp, then she looked at me. Dara. It's a long story. It's always a long story with you. Your previous mechanic at Veloren told you that your number 4 injection rail was within tolerance, I said, moving back toward the access panel. It isn't. I want to look at the sensor output before I give you a number, but you should know it's on the list. She followed. How long have you known about the injection rail? Since your last visit. I noted it in my supplementary record. The one they can't classify, she said. Oh. She was quiet for a moment. I could hear her working through it. Helen Morrish is not a slow thinker. She just prefers to think before she speaks, which I have always found to be an undervalued quality in a ship's captain. The stamp, she said, that's what did it. The stamp is what they couldn't process, I said. Whether it did anything is a question for their framework. It got us out of a hold. It got you a compliant audit result for the current visit, yes. You carry that thing everywhere. My mentor gave it to me. I crouched in front of the access panel and picked up my diagnostic tablet, pulling up the sensor output log. She said a signed record is a record that exists in 2 places at once. One place is the filing system. The other place is on the paper, and nobody can reach into the paper and change it without leaving a mark. I found the number 4 rail readout and looked at it. She was talking about service records specifically, but I think she may have meant it more broadly. Helen Morrish crouched beside me and looked at the readout. That's not great, she said. No, it's not, but it's manageable in this window if we prioritize. Then let's prioritize. We got back to work. I want to tell you about my mentor, because she's part of this story whether she's in it or not, and because the stamp doesn't mean what it means unless you understand where it came from. Her name was Solène Vanthorpe, and she worked as a licensed mechanic at Calvin Waystation for 31 years before she retired, and she was the first qualified mechanic I worked under when I came to Calvin as a trainee at 22. She was 57 at the time, which felt very old to me then and feels very young to me now. She had gray hair she kept cut close because long hair and rotating machinery have a well-documented adversarial relationship, and she had the particular kind of competence that doesn't need to announce itself, the kind that shows up in the work and only becomes visible when you realize, some years later, that you've been doing things her way without consciously deciding to do them her way. She had opinions about paper forms, strong ones which she delivered without drama, the way she delivered most things. The physical forms at Calvin had been technically required but practically ignored for most of her career. She filled them out anyway, every visit, every job. She used a brass stamp she'd bought from a retiring mechanic during her second year, a stamp that had that mechanic's license number in it and that she never had re-engraved because, she said, the license number was not the point. The physical impression in the certified field was the point. The fact of the stamp, the deliberate, manual act of pressing something solid and permanent onto paper and letting the ink set for a count of 10 was the point. It was the clearest possible statement that a human being with a credential had looked at this work and was willing to put their name on it in a form that couldn't be edited, couldn't be retroactively modified, couldn't be altered in a database update at 3 in the morning when nobody was watching. When she retired, she had her own stamp made with her actual license number, DKT9 Mechanic VANTHORPE, mine, my license, registered in my name, and she gave it to me with no ceremony. I asked why not keep her own. She said, "I'm not going to be the one who needs it." She taught me the physical forms because she believed in them, and she taught me to believe in them not by argument but by example, which is the only way that kind of belief really takes root. She taught me to keep supplementary records because she kept supplementary records, a parallel history of every vessel she'd worked on, every finding, every judgment call, everything that the official record captured and everything it missed. She taught me to note atmospheric conditions at commencement not because they'd mattered in any case she'd handled, but because the habit of thoroughness doesn't know in advance which details will matter and which won't, and a thorough habit maintained when it doesn't matter is the only kind of thorough habit that can be relied on when it does. The habit has to be unconditional. The moment you start deciding which details are worth capturing and which aren't, you've already introduced the judgment that will fail you on the day your judgment is off. She also taught me about gaps. Systems break down, she said. This was 3 years into my time at Calvin, during a long afternoon when a manifold job had run over and we were both waiting on a parts delivery. All of them. The digital ones, the paper ones, the institutional ones. Everything develops gaps eventually. The question is what you've got left when the gap opens. She wasn't talking about contingency planning in any tactical sense. She was talking about accumulated small habits, the note at commencement, the extra half-turn on the worn housing, the supplementary record nobody technically requires you to keep, the stamp pressed into a pad nobody technically requires you to use. She was talking about the difference between doing the documented version of a job and doing the job itself. Most of the time those are identical. Sometimes they aren't. On the days they aren't, it matters enormously which one you've been building the habit of. The Vreth compliance engine is a remarkable system. I mean that without irony or condescension. It is large, internally consistent, developed over a very long time by an organization that takes compliance seriously in a way that most human institutions don't. Because for the Vreth, compliance isn't a procedural inconvenience but something structurally close to ethics. They believe genuinely that a well-maintained record is a form of honesty, and that an accurate compliance chain is a form of trust extended across parties who might otherwise have reason to doubt each other. I respect that. It's an idea that would not have surprised Solène Vanthorpe, and she was not easy to impress. But the engine was built on digital infrastructure by parties who were both, at the time of its construction, operating entirely in the digital space. The physical form at Calvin predates the engine's relevant framework by decades. It predates the Calvin Accord by decades. It is still legally valid under the Compact Charter because nobody ever removed it. Removing it would have required someone to decide it needed removing, and nobody ever decided that, because it's a physical paper form in a physical cabinet at a mid-range waystation, and it causes no problems and nobody thinks about it. The things that nobody thinks about are frequently the things that matter at the moments that matter. That is one of the more consistent observations I've made in 11 years. The Vreth compliance engine had categories for everything within its scope: digital maintenance records, digital credential validations, digital compliance flags, digital petition submissions, the interactions of all of these things across the full scope of the Joint Transit Framework. It had subsections and cross-reference tables and escalation pathways and retroactive review provisions and mutual recognition subroutines. It was thorough. It was comprehensive within its domain. It did not have a category for a paper form with an ink impression stamp in the certified field, because nobody who built the engine had ever thought to include one, because by the time the engine was built, the relevant parties had been operating in a digital-only environment for long enough that paper forms authenticated by ink stamps were not a live possibility anyone needed to account for. The gap wasn't negligence. It was a reasonable omission. The world the engine was built to govern was a fully digital world, and in that world the omission was invisible. It couldn't flag what it couldn't classify. The compliance review mechanism had no hook. The result, which the Vreth lead had worked through with the careful precision of a system following unexpected logic to its honest conclusion, was that the current visit's maintenance was documented in a format legally valid under the Compact Charter, but entirely outside the scope of the authority's audit tools. It could not be assessed as non-compliant. And because the current visit's work could not be assessed as non-compliant, the grounds for a hold dissolved. The gap in the fence was a sheet of paper and a dented brass stamp. Solène Vanthorpe would have appreciated the shape of it. She'd retired well before the accord was finalized, and the Vreth inspection regime started cycling through Calvin. I told her about the first Vreth audit I sat through, on one of our regular calls, and she asked questions the way she always does: methodical, specific, more interested in mechanism than in outcome. She asked about the authority's documentation requirements. She asked about audit scope. She asked, specifically, whether the authority's framework had any provision for physical records. I told her I didn't know. "Find out," she said. "That's the kind of thing that matters." I found out. It took several weeks of reading publicly available framework documentation, which is not the most engaging reading I've done in my career. The answer was no. No provision. No category. The framework existed entirely in the digital space and had not built a schema entry for physical paper records authenticated by physical means. I noted this in my supplementary records file, the same file I've kept since my first year at Calvin. I noted it as a fact, not a plan. You note the fact. You maintain the habits. You carry the stamp. You don't know in advance which facts will matter, you just make sure you're the kind of person who has them available when they do. I finished the injection rail assessment by early afternoon. One sensor was drifting worse than I'd initially estimated, not dangerous yet, but requiring correction within 2 transit cycles. I replaced the drifting sensor, logged the replacement in both records. The digital entry in the Port Authority system, time-stamped and credential validated, and the physical form update, initialed and stamped. Hella signed the captain's copy of the physical form with the blue ballpoint she's been refilling for years, because I asked her to sign her copy when I started servicing her ship, and she asked why, and I told her about Solen Vanthorpe and the two-place record, and she said that was sensible, and she's signed every time since. We finished with just over 40 minutes left in the window. The Constance's manifold stack was in the best shape it had been for 3 visits. The injection rails were assessed, and the drifting sensor was replaced and documented. The pressure gauge calibration remained uncorrected, because Hella remains unconvinced the 2.3% drift justifies the cost. But it's in my record and it'll stay there until she corrects it or someone tells her she has to. Hella Morris shook my hand at the foot of the boarding ramp, both hands, the way she always does at the end of a visit, a habit I've never asked about and she's never explained, and said, "The Vreth documentation for the prior cycle, the petition process, is that something I actually have to pursue? The authority will send the paperwork. You'll want to forward it to the Threshold Mechanics licensing body. She may already be in the process of completing her cross-registration. A lot of compact mechanics have been doing it since the accord settled. If she is, the petition is mostly administrative. If she isn't, you'll want to encourage her to start. And if she doesn't, then the prior cycle's record stays under review, which means the authority may raise it again at a future audit." I paused. "But the current visit's record is clean, both of them." Helen nodded slowly. She looked at the physical form, her copy, with my stamp in the certified field and her own signature in the captain's line. She folded it with the careful deliberateness of someone putting something in a pocket they intend to keep. "Tell me something," she said. "If you hadn't had the stamp, if you'd gone paperless like everyone else." "We'd be talking about a compliance hold and a petition timeline," I said. "And you'd miss your connection at Selen. How long have you been carrying that thing?" 11 years. Every day. Every day." She looked at me with the expression of someone recalculating something they thought they already had the measure of. "And you just knew?" "No," I said, "I just carried it." She released my hands and stepped back toward the ramp. The Constance's boarding hatch sealed behind her with a sound I've heard 217 times, a slightly hollow, slightly resonant thump, because the hatch seal on berth side A has a different acoustic signature from berth side B. And this is another detail in my supplementary records that nobody technically requires me to note, and that will matter on some future visit in some way I can't currently predict. I watch the Constance pull out. Hella runs a conservative departure sequence, which I approve of, the thrusters firing in the order I've memorized over years of watching from this spot, everything within expected timing. Then she was past the berth boundary and into the transit lane, and she was someone else's concern until the next time she came through calving. I went back to the mechanics station, cleaned my tools, restaged the work cart, put the ink pad back in the drawer, put the brass stamp back in my breast pocket. There was a notification waiting in the Port Authority system. The Ilva Constance's current visit compliance status logged as confirmed. Audit result filed. Clean record. No flags on the current visit. I sat with that for a moment. There is a satisfaction in a clean audit that is specific to this work, not pride exactly, more like the feeling of a fitting torqued to the correct value, the reading landing where it should. It is a small thing. It happens hundreds of times in a career, and it is a small thing every time. But it is the small things done correctly and repeatedly, and without variation, that build whatever else there is to build, and I have never found a reason to hold that satisfaction cheaply. The Vreth team's departure paperwork was in the system. Their audit records were filed, correctly and completely, in the way they always filed their records. I reviewed the notation on the Constance's entry, the compliance confirmation, the open petition flag on the prior cycle's record, the reference number for the documentation they would send to Hella Morris. Everything in order, everything where it was supposed to be. I filed my copy of the physical work order in the filing cabinet at the back of the station. The same cabinet Solène Vanthorpe used for 31 years. The label on the front reading mechanics records in a font that hasn't been manufactured since before I was born. I pulled out the drawer by feel, the way I always do, found the right folder by the tab, and filed the form in date order behind the previous Constance visit, where it would sit for the required 7-year retention period and then be archived. Nobody would read it, that was fine, it existed, that was the point. Then I sat down, took out my tablet and called her. She answered on the second ring. Solène Vanthorpe answers her calls promptly because she always has, because she considers not answering when you're available to answer a form of discourtesy, which is consistent with how she approaches most things. "Something happened," I said. "Tell me," she said. I told her about the Constance, about the Vreth audit and the compliance flag and the retroactive cross-registration question, about the hold that almost landed and how close the margin was, about the gap in the authority's schema, the fact I'd found in publicly available documentation 3 years ago and noted in my supplementary records file and never used until this morning. I told her what I'd done: the ink pad, the physical form, the stamp pressed in the certified field and let to set for a count of 10. I kept it factual and specific, the way she taught me, because she doesn't like it when people editorialize about their own judgment, and because this particular story does not need editorializing. It holds on its own. There was a pause when I finished, not a long one. She doesn't take long when the facts are clear. "The stamp," she said. "The stamp," I said. Another pause, a longer one. I could hear her breathing, the particular quality of silence that means she's sitting with something rather than formulating a reply. Then, "Good." Just that. One word. From a woman who taught me 31 years of mechanics by example and could have said a dozen things, that she'd known it would matter, that this was why she told me to carry it, that the system had worked the way she'd always understood systems to work at their edges. She said none of those things. She said good, and the good landed with the weight of all the rest of it compressed into one syllable, the way a torque reading lands when it's exactly where it should be. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I've sat through 9 Vreth audits. I've maintained the Constance through 217 service visits. I've kept the physical forms and the supplementary records and the stamp in my breast pocket and the ink pad in the drawer. And I've noted atmospheric conditions at commencement and torque values over spec and pressure gauge drift and injection rail sensor degradation. And on most days, none of this matters in any visible way. It's just the work, done the way it's supposed to be done, documented the way it's supposed to be documented, filed and logged and carried forward without drama or recognition. And then there is one morning in Berth 41 when the gap opens, and what you have left is whatever you've been carrying. I put the tablet face down on the desk and sat for a moment in the quiet of the mechanics station. The waystation's ambient systems hummed at a frequency I stopped consciously registering years ago. Berth 41 was empty, the Constance's berth shadow gone, the overhead lights even and flat over the sealed gray composite floor. Through the berth viewport, which looks out over Colvin's transit lane, I could see the traffic. 2 haulers in the visible portion of the lane, a survey tender I didn't recognize, the distant thermal flare of a departing shuttle catching the light. All of it moving on its own schedule, its own compliance chains, its own accumulated paperwork, some of it digital, and some of it filed in cabinets in the backs of rooms that nobody thinks about until the day when the thinking about them is exactly the thing that matters. I thought about the Vreth lead, about the care with which it had worked through the logic, following its own framework to a conclusion it hadn't anticipated. It was not a hostile system. It was a thorough one, and it had arrived at the correct answer by its own rules, which is, I think, the best you can ask of any system built by anyone. The gap existed in its framework. It acknowledged the gap. it acted accordingly. There was a kind of honesty in that I could respect. The stamp was in my breast pocket. I stood up, picked up my bag, and went to check whether the Vreth team had filed their departure paperwork in the Port Authority system, because there is always more paperwork, and it does not file itself, and that is the work, and I do the work. That's the whole story.